This is what the Christian life, in part, is all about. There's some subjects that are so fascinating you can't wait to get to them, like this one. Sheol, Hades, Paradise and Gehenna, and Hell, the lake of fire. I can't wait to get to these subjects, but you better, because there's so many ideas about the destiny of man, eternal and temporal-wise, that if you don't understand some of these key words here, you'll realize that you've misinterpreted a passage, wholly misinterpreted it. Dr. Robert A. Morey wrote a book, Death and the Afterlife. It's a great book, and I've got an excerpt from it here. So, let's begin. Sheol. The Hebrew word Sheol is found 66 times in the Old Testament, while the Old Testament consistently, the Hebrew Bible, refers to the body as going to the grave. It always refers to the soul or spirit of man as going to Sheol. And we have cleared up a bunch of passages already. We have lexicographical material. He really does well to document his studies. So this is the sources that you can look at. In the Old Testament, man does not cease to exist at death, but his soul descends to Sheol. So modern scholarship understands the word Sheol to refer to the place where the soul or spirit of man goes at death. None of the lexicographical literature defines Sheol as referring to the grave or to passing into non-existence. I try not to pronounce words that have more than 3 syllables. Comparative studies. So in order to understand what a certain word meant in an ancient language, it is sometimes helpful to find any parallel works in the other languages of that time. Thus, comparative studies of Sheol have been done, which demonstrate that Sheol's parallels in other languages meant the place where the soul of man goes at death. No research has found a place where Sheol's parallel means the grave or non-existence, as many cults will tell you. For example, Ugaritic Ars and Akkadian Su'alu clearly refer to the netherworld, and the Babylonians, Assyrians, Egyptians, and Greek parallels to Sheol clearly meant the place of departed spirits. The Ethiopian Sheol cannot mean anything other than the netherworld, the place of conscious life after death. So what is important about comparative studies is that they place biblical words in their historical context. Keep in mind, this is a great approach to reading anything, especially the Scriptures. The word Sheol should thus be understood in terms of what it meant in the Hebrew language and by its parallel in the other languages of that time. Why? When God wanted Israel to believe anything which was unique and contrary to what the surrounding culture believed, and soul sleep would be unique and contrary, he always clearly condemned and forbade the pagan beliefs and then stressed the uniqueness of the new concept. For example, in order to establish monotheism, God repeatedly and clearly condemned the pagan concept of polytheism and stressed monotheism. While God clearly condemned polytheism in the Old Testament, and at no time did he ever condemn belief in a conscious afterlife, at no time did God ever put forth the concept of annihilation or non-existence as the fate of man's soul at death, nor condemn the concept of conscious afterlife. So clear up a bunch of people that you've been talking to. Also, when Israel had a unique and contrary belief, the pagan societies around Israel would use this belief as the grounds to persecute the Jews. Thus the Jews were persecuted for rejecting polytheism and believing in monotheism. Daniel's 3 friends, who were thrown into a fire furnace, are an excellent example of such persecution. Yet, where in recorded history did pagan religions or societies persecute the Jews because they denied a conscious afterlife? To think that the Jews could go against the universally held concept of a conscious afterlife, and that the pagans would not seize upon this as a pretense for persecution is absurd. It's a good thinker, this author. Since the universality of belief in a conscious afterlife is irrefutable, and since there is no evidence that Israel deviated from this belief, we must assume that the Old Testament taught a conscious afterlife in Sheol as the fate of man's soul or spirit. Moving forward another step, let's compare Sheol and the grave. King James Version translates Sheol as hell 31 times, grave 31 times, and pit 3 times. Because of this inconsistency of the translation in the King James Version, objectors to a conscious afterlife have taught that Sheol means the grave. But Sheol cannot mean the grave. First, exegetically speaking, the initial occurrence of Sheol in the Old Testament cannot mean the grave. The word Sheol is first found in Genesis 37:35. After the brothers had sold Joseph into slavery, they informed their fathers that Joseph had been killed and devoured by a savage beast. As Jacob held the bloodied and tattered remains of Joseph's coat in his hands, he declared, "A wild beast has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn into pieces." As a result of the shock of the death of Joseph, Jacob cried out, "Surely I will go down to Sheol in mourning for my son." This is in the Hebrew. There are several things about this first occurrence of Sheol which should be pointed out. Jacob assumed that his son was still alive and conscious after death, and that he would eventually reunite with his son after his own death. The German commentator Lang comments, "One thing is clear, Joseph's death was not a state of non-being. Jacob was going to be with his son. He was still his son. There was yet a tie between him and his son. He is spoken of as a personality, yet is still regarded as having a being somehow and somewhere." So, point 2, whatever else Sheol may mean in this passage, it cannot mean Joseph's grave. For Jacob believed that Joseph had been devoured by an animal and had no grave. Since Joseph had no grave, it is impossible for Jacob to be referring to being buried in a common grave with his son. According to the context of Jacob in point 3, it's clearly speaking of reuniting with his favored son in the underworld, here called Sheol. He even speaks of going down to reunite with his son, because it is assumed that Sheol was a place of departed spirits, probably a hollow place in the center of the earth. That's how it's so described elsewhere. The second reason for identifying Sheol as the grave is that when the biblical authors wanted to speak of the grave, they used the Hebrew word kevar for not identifying Sheol as the grave. That they did not view kevar and Sheol as synonymous is clear from the way these words are used throughout the Old Testament. For example, in Isaiah 14:19, the king is figuratively cast out of his grave, kevar, in order to be thrown into Sheol, where the departed spirits can rebuke him. In this passage, Sheol and kevar are opposites, not synonyms. Isaiah 14:9-11, "Sheol below is all astir to meet you, the oppressor Sennacherib, the now dead tyrant king of Babylon. At your coming, it rouses the spirits of the dead, Rephaim, to greet you, all those who were leaders in the world. It makes them rise from their thrones," a sarcastic figure of speech, for there are no thrones indicated as existing in Sheol. All those who were kings over the nations, referring to spirits of the dead, Rephaim, a word as defined in theological wordbook of the Old Testament, an idea of Ugaritic origin, which means the dead inhabitants of the netherworld, which indicates a conscious, albeit spirit, existence after death. After Sennacherib is clearly indicated in this passage as dead, yet still existing in a different sphere, the sphere of Sheol. For her, in Proverbs 2:18, the adulteress her house leads down to death, and her path to the spirits of the dead, the Rephaim. Isaiah 14:9-11 continued, "They, the dead ex-leaders of the world in Sheol, will all respond. They will say to you, 'You, Sennacherib, also have become weak as we are. You have become like us. All your pomp has been brought down to Sheol, along with the noise of your harps. Maggots are spread out beneath you, and worms cover you," referring to the dead corpse of his physical body, which was buried in a common grave, and not in the customary tomb for a king, having been assassinated by his sons, and purposely not given a kingly burial in a tomb. The physical sight of his dead body in a common grave, covered with worms and maggots, is portrayed in contrast to the conscious conversation with him which was going on in Sheol with other dead kings, a different place from the grave. Third, in the Septuagint, Sheol is never translated as Menema, which is the Greek word for grave. It is also translated as Hades, which meant the underworld. Kevar is never translated as Hades, just as Sheol is never translated as Menema. Fourth, Kevar and Sheol are never used in the Hebrew poetic parallelism as equivalents. They are always contrasted and never equated. Kevar is the fate of the body, while Sheol is the fate of the soul. Look at Psalm 16:8-11. "I have set the Lord always before me, because he is at my right hand. I will not be shaken. Therefore my heart is glad, and my tongue rejoices. My body also will rest secure, because you will not abandon me to Sheol, nor will you let your body, Holy One, see decay. David, who was holy, was considered here, set apart for salvation unto eternal life, as later referred to Jesus Christ. Alan P. Ross states in the Bible Knowledge Commentary, David was assured that the Lord would preserve his life in the face of death. He rejoiced because God enabled his body to rest securely even when confronted with death. The reason he could rest is that God would not abandon him to the grave nor let his Holy One see decay. This refers to David, who describes himself as God's Holy One, that is, one of God's saints. He took comfort in the fact that God would not, at that time, allow his body to die and decay in the grave. In other words, he would be resurrected at some time. In fact, God had caused him to know the path of life, so he anticipated experiencing further joy in God's presence. Death posed no threat to David because he enjoyed great blessing and fellowship with the Lord. God would not permit death in the grave to interrupt that marvelous fellowship, so soul sleep was obviously out of the question in David's mind. You have made known to me the path of life, David says to God. You will fill me with joy in your presence, with eternal pleasures at your right hand. Look at Philippians 1:23. The Apostle Paul states, I am torn between the two. To live is Christ, to die is gain. I desire to depart. In other words, die, and be with Christ. Okay, who at that moment, and this is in heaven, which indicates that Paul would be conscious with the Lord in heaven, which is better by far. But it is more necessary for you that I remain in the body, Paul says to those he's writing to in Philippians, further indicating that the only after alternative offered, not to be in the body, to be physically dead, results in a conscious existence and presence with Jesus Christ in heaven, where he now resides. Maury writes, Fifth, Sheol is under the earth, or the underworld, while graves were built as sepulchres above the earth, or caves or holes in the earth. Sheol is called the underworld. Isaiah 14:9. Sheol is below, is all astir. It is also called the lower parts of the earth. Isaiah 44:23. Ezekiel 26:20. Then I will bring you down with those who go down to the pit. To the people of long ago I will make you dwell in the earth below, as in ancient ruins, with those who go down to the pit, and you will not return or take your place in the land of the living. We have other corroborative passages in Ezekiel and also Psalm 63:9. But those that seek my soul to destroy it shall go into the lower parts of the earth. Sheol is the opposite of heaven. If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. One must go down to get to Sheol, in other words. Genesis 37:34-35. Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he said, in the morning will I go down to Sheol to my son. So his father wept for him. Notice that Jacob could not be saying that when he dies, he would have his dead son dug up to have Jacob's body placed in the same grave with his son. Certainly, Jacob means that he will see his son in the afterlife. Sixth, while bodies are unconscious in the grave, those in Sheol are viewed as being conscious. Look at these passages. 7. An examination of the usages of Kebar and Sheol reveals that Sheol cannot mean the grave. The following 20 contrasts between Kebar and Sheol demonstrates this point. You can look at all these references here. It's almost irrefutable that Sheol is one thing and the grave is another. So now we have Sheol and its inhabitants. The following things are stated after Sheol and its inhabitants. First, Sheol is said to have gates, by which one enters, and bars which keep one in. Such figurative language conveys the idea that Sheol is a realm from which is no escape possible. Second, the Old Testament describes Sheol in the following ways. Sheol is the shadowy place or place of darkness, evidently is in another dimension which is not exposed to the rays of the sun. It is viewed as being down or beneath the earth or in the lower parts of the earth. These figures of speech indicate that Sheol is not a part of this world, but has an existence of its own in another dimension. It is a place where one can reunite with his ancestors, tribe, or people. This cannot refer to one common mass grave where everyone is buried. No such graves ever existed in recorded history. Sheol is the place where the souls of all men go at death. That is why Jacob looked forward to reuniting with Joseph in Sheol. While death meant separation from the living, the Old Testament prophets clearly understood that it also meant reunion with the departed. It seems that Sheol has different sections. There is the contrast between the lowest part and the higher part of Sheol. This figurative